Welcome to the first in what we are hoping will be a series of interviews with many of our senior faculty. The overarching theme is honoring our professional legacy, a history of NYU Postdoc. As we are beginning with an interview with one of our most senior faculty members, Ruth Gruenthal, we're going to spend about an hour in which I'm going to ask Ruth lots of questions, and she is going to tell us a lot about her history and involvement in postdoc. From this interview, we will be moving on to do many others, but this is the first, and I'm delighted to welcome you, Ruth, to hear your story. So, Ruth, you have an unusual and complicated personal history and professional history, and I think that folks at Postdoc would be really interested in kind of hearing your story from the beginning. How did you end up here? Know that you were born in Hamburg. What happened to you during the war? How'd you get here? And what was it like?
It's a pretty big question you're asking.
Yep.
I will try to be as brief as I can. So while I was born in Hamburg, actually did not live there very long. Because of family reasons, we briefly lived in Berlin before I was sent to a boarding school, first in Germany, and then because of family and political circumstances, to a boarding school in Switzerland, in Davos, as they would say here.
Mm-hmm. Not a bad place to be.
Right, actually not such a bad place to be, although actually I took up ice skating rather than skiing there, which was probably a mistake.
Oh.
but I was completely fascinated with ice skating, and they had an Olympic-sized skating rink. Anyhow, so after we spent some time there, I was then sent to a boarding school in the Netherlands, which was founded by the Quakers for German refugee children.
And this was before Hitler had invaded the Netherlands?
This was before.
Okay.
This is all before the beginning of World War II. So, so my sister and I were in this boarding school, which was actually an interesting school. First of all, it was on the grounds of a very beautiful small castle with a moat around it. And there were two large stables on each side of the castle, which they had converted into dormitories and classrooms. So it was an unusual school in that most of the faculty had been university professors at various German and Austrian universities, and actually were not equipped to deal with high school kids, because in Europe, in universities, the students are completely on their own. Faculty has no parental functions whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So they kind of had to adjust to the fact that we needed more supervision. In fact, they were very nervous about what was going on in all these teenagers. It was a high school age population, basically. So we were on vacation in Paris, where my father had managed to actually be able to emigrate to France once Hitler came to power late in 1936. And my sister and I joined him and my stepmother while the school was on vacation in the summer of '39, when World War II broke out.
And you're in Paris.
We were in Paris.
Uh-huh.
They had been living in Paris since late '36.
And you spoke French or enough French?
Not really.
Uh-huh.
Not really.
At Canterbury.
I mean, I had some French, but mostly in the boarding school. The idea was to prepare us for British university entrance exam, what they call O-level at the time, entrance exams, so that if you managed to get out to Great Britain or anywhere in that university system, that we would have a way of getting in. But anyway, so the French officials, for reasons of their own, refused to give my sister and me permission to stay, and they also refused to give us permission to leave. So basically, she and I were
stateless.
Not state. We were declared stateless later by the Nazis. Not as far as the French were concerned.
Okay.
We had no legal status,
Uh-huh.
and so in France, everybody had to carry a carte d'identité, an identity card that you could be asked for at any point. So we carried our passports, which already then had a sign in the passport that we were declared stateless by the Germans, and so we were there as German refugees. That we were declared stateless by the Germans. Also, all the names in the passport had been changed. All the women's names were changed to Sarah. All the men's first names were changed to Moses.
Just a tad of anti-Semitism in that.
No, this was done by the Germans.
Like I said.
Yes. I mean, that was, with a big Morgan Dovet stamped on the passport.
Uh-huh.
Nonetheless, when I was asked for my passport at one point, some policeman decided he would stop my sister and me and ask me for my passport. He saw it was a German passport and spat at me and said, "Sal Bosch."
Lovely.
That's dirty German translated. So, in case there's any doubt about that.
Right.
So actually, I then was trying to finish what I was sort of in my, I think, the end of my junior year, would be junior year high school or beginning senior year. So I was anxious to go on studying and managed to get into what was called the American School of Paris, which had been evacuated with the beginning of World War II to Normandy, to a very famous resort called Étretat, which is famous for having a very distinctive rock formation.
Mm-hmm.
So the school had been evacuated there, and I actually went there for a few months until the Germans began to invade, going toward the Netherlands and Belgium, and began to approach France, and also began to bomb this area. So school closed.
So when you were in Paris, the Germans were not there yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, they had not. They were just starting their move from Germany into the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. So the bombing happened. The school, of course, closed, and as soon as I returned to Paris, I had just turned 16. I had to report as an enemy alien to a collecting center, which was a famous bicycle racing place called Velodrome d'Hiver.
That's where they did the roundups.
That's where they later did the roundups in 1942.
Right.
So here, instead of being rounded up because we were Jewish, we were rounded up because we were German.
Right.
So that's sort of the irony.
That's what you call double jeopardy.
It was the same collecting point, which was this kind of insane bicycle racing place, one of those that has this little soup plate shaped center where the bikes go around. Right.
Yeah.
And we were sleeping. There were very steep stands that we were sleeping on with wooden folding seats.
Yeah.
Where we were sleeping. So we were held there for a while until they decided to move us into what was basically a very large camp in the Pyrenees in France, which had originally been created to hold the about 500,000 refugees from Franco-Spain that came over the border. And this was a camp that was particularly large because it was close. It was just on the other side of the border near Lourdes, so in the Pyrenees, and which was partially filled still with Spaniards who were sort of doing work around the place. So they had some space left in there, and so they put all of us enemy alien, including real Germans.
That must have been fun.
Not refugees. Well, it was mostly these were older women.
Uh-huh.
I mean, because we were all women, and this was like a women's section of the camp, but they made, I mean, anyone who was of German origin. Many of these women actually had sons who were born in France. They had come there for some reason earlier, married French men, had children who were French citizens, and some of them were already in the French army, and nonetheless they were held. They were put behind barbed wire.
And they weren't Jewish.
They're not Jewish.
Right.
Not. So this was a kind of mixed population, and which was sort of willy-nilly the French just kind of put together, and it was going from Paris was a very long train trip, and I was actually busying myself trying to help some of the women who had sons in the French army, writing letters to the government, whose French, even though they had been living in France, his French was not very good. So I was trying to help out, even though my French was far from perfect itself, but better than theirs. So I would write letters to them, also letters to German authorities, trying to see if somebody would just let them go.
And that did not happen.
Probably not.
Yeah. But this camp was all the way in the south west of France.
It was closer to the Mediterranean. I don't know if you know where Lourdes is.
Yeah.
So it's closer to, I would say, pretty much due north of Barcelona.
Okay. So really at the Spanish border.
Really at the but also toward the Mediterranean side.
Right.
But as the Germans were beginning to advance into France, the soldiers that were the French soldiers that were guarding this camp decided that they wanted to just blend into the population, and so they tried to shut down as much of the camp as they could, so they could get away. And
because they were afraid of the Germans?
They were afraid of the Germans.
Okay.
I mean, they were just going to take off their uniform and blend into the local population and disappear that way. That was,
not a terrible idea.
Not terrible. So one of the problems was that there had been there were all kinds of rumors about what was going on outside the camp, and one of the stories that was going around was that if we went out, because they offered to give us a discharge paper, which I still have, actually, but what I should also mention that by a miracle, I got into the same section of the camp where my aunt, my father's sister, already was. So I was actually not completely on my own, which made a huge amount of difference. And my aunt and I actually had decided, after talking it over, that even though we were told that if they discovered that we were German, they would stone us to death.
They meaning the French.
They being the local population. Right. That we decided we would take a chance, since they speak, as you know, a heavy dialect called Languedoc.
Yeah. And your sister was there or no?
No, my sister was under 16.
Mm-hmm.
My sister, my stepmother, therefore did not have to report. So 16 was the cutoff age, and the parent, the responsible parent of the under 16 child could also stay out.
So they were where?
In Paris. They stayed in Paris until the Germans started to advance, and so they joined this huge stream of population, which has been documented, I think, quite extensively.
And that novel, whatever it was
just
called.
the French novel, but because she only talks about the French, she doesn't mention any of the other.
Of course not.
Because it was really a stream of people from, all the way from the Netherlands who were fleeing the Germans. I mean, many of them, of course, Jews.
Right.
A Jewish population that was in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and so forth. So, so they felt they had to escape, and so together with some neighbors and so on, they formed a small group and joined this huge stream of population going toward the south of France. So where, of course, my aunt and I had already ended up. And then we had heard that near Biarritz there were some Polish boats going to England. So she and I decided to walk from one side of the Pyrenees to the Atlantic side, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic side of the Pyrenees, just on our own, and to see if we could talk our way onto one of his ships. That was the plan. However, so we actually made it to the other side with the help of some farmers that would let us stay in the barn somewhere and gave us some food. And of course, since we spoke an accented but clearly not local French, we passed.
So they thought that you were French. They didn't think that you were.
Well, they did. I mean, since they were really refugees coming from all over, so we could sort of blend in with this kind of population mix that ended up, and it also meant that the Red Cross began to set up some soup kitchens, so occasionally we could also find some food.
So how long did this take you, crossing the Pyrenees, which you have told me you did at night?
No, we were going along the Pyrenees. This was not
you're
crossing.
Just going south.
We were staying in France, trying to get onto a ship to go to a Polish ship to go to Great Britain. So this was stage one. So of the what became an escape. So we arrived in actually we were in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is just south of Biarritz, is a fancier resort, and so we ended up there, and managed to talk the owner of one hotel to let us sleep in the dining room, under the dining room tables on the floor, for one night. And then, unfortunately, the armistice was signed between the French and the Germans, and this part of France became German-occupied zone.
Right.
I mean, this is when the Vichy zone was formed, so we had to escape from there. Actually, it turned out that the guy who was either managing or owned this hotel used to work for the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme, where my father had his office, and he had heard about my father. So he gave us a little bit of money just to be helpful. And we got together with a few other people, and in one of these old French cars that was sort of like a model something or other Ford, it was like square and high. We would sit three on top of each other, and in order to fit the maximum number, and all kind of shared, paid a certain amount of money to get taken back to the Vichy zone. In a very sort of hairy ride. I mean, you can imagine three people sitting on top of each other.
It doesn't sound like fun.
I was considered, even though I was considered the lightest weight, so
You were on top, yes.
I was on top.
Of course you were.
I was on top. And so we decided that since the rest of my family, my father actually also had to report to a camp. He was clearly also over 16. Mm-hmm. So during this whole period of time, he was like in 3 different internment camps that varied in the severity. And some were sort of more like holding camps where they could go out and do some work and make some money in whatever area they were in. And they were actually sort of considered almost like an auxiliary to the French army. They were called prestataires, which is like a working force, some kind of labor force. So they were not quite as, they were not described, they were described more as prestataires rather than as enemy alien, and were not quite as restricted, like behind barbed wire as we were. And actually in the camp, I should mention, conditions were really pretty horrendous, because the camp, among other things, was, first of all, they could get no supplies of food because of the disruption with the German army starting to move south. Disruption of all food transports. So they were not actually trying to starve us to death, but basically there was no food, or very little food. And the camp was built on clay ground, so every time it rained, it became So conditions were not very good. But anyway, so we were now driving back on these hairpin roads with these columns of people sitting on top of each other, and we decided that since the family knew that we were in this camp, and it was in the Vichy zone and sort of to the south of the Vichy zone, that if anyone was going to come looking for us, it was likely that they would look in that area. And so we decided to go back. There was a Saint-Marie-Saint-Oleron. There was a small town near the camp where we actually found some shelter in a church basement. So my aunt and I, and we basically spent our time standing on street corners, giving people pieces of paper, giving our location, and saying, if you run into my father, if you run into anyone else connected to us that we could think of, please give them this. And we in turn received notices from other people, so it was an exchange of these pieces of paper, giving people's locations, since there's really no other way of communicating at that point. I made one trip out to the outside of the camp, but decided not to go any closer when I saw actually SS people going into the camp. The Vichy government was allowing them to do that and to actually go through and take people who were Jewish and
ship them back to Germany.
Ship them into concentration camps. So
you're lucky that
I realized
did not happen.
I realized that this was not a good place for me to hang out.
No.
So at that point, so we basically spent our time and because of the geographic situation, all of us actually ended up in the southern end. All the family members, including there was also somebody who was a housekeeper for my parents who was Polish, who was coming along, and somebody worked in my father's office, so a higher up person who was along with him, and he eventually actually found my stepmother and my sister before he got one of the slips of paper that either my aunt or I had handed out to somebody, and actually got to him.
Wow.
I mean, which is
Amazing.
totally. I mean, that
Yeah.
plus the fact that, that I got into this huge camp, the same section as my aunt was in.
Yeah, it's
Was in
amazing.
a
Right.
total chance. So we all eventually ended up in a place called Montauban, which is just east of, is it west? It's west of Toulouse. So sort of in the central, more or less central France. That my father sent somebody to come and get us, actually, with some money so we could actually take a train. Because we were now much further south than Montauban. Montauban was more central part of the Vichy zone. And so we were all, so my father and my stepmother had a room in the main house. The rest of us were in garden sheds. But, we would make trips for food. We somehow found some bikes, and we made trips for food into the countryside, trying to talk farmers into giving us some food.
So there was no army presence there.
This was a Vichy zone.
I know that,
I
but
mean, other than those who were kind of invited in by Vichy personnel that was collaborating with the German. So this remained a kind of clear. There was no army occupying this particular location. I mean, there was always a risk that they would come after somebody, and deport them. But where we were was considered used to be a socialist stronghold. So the population was less likely to kind of give us away. And so basically my father spent his time with me acting as his secretary to try and see where we could go, where we could get a visa and get out of France. It was very clear that staying there was completely untenable. I mean, that it was just totally unsafe. And I think this was still early, once the Vichy zone was created, things kept, after we left, things got considerably worse. So got even more dangerous. So at first it looked as though the Philippines was the only place that we could get out of. And then Eleanor Roosevelt, established what was called Operation Rescue. In fact, when the Holocaust Museum first opened, I don't know whether it's still there. It had its own separate little building that described her efforts to get all of us out, even though this was a pretty elitist operation. I mean, you were selected to get an emergency visitor's visa, if your presence in the U.S. was going to be of benefit to
it hasn't changed a lot,
was going to be of benefit to the...
Right.
So, since this was by and large... in fact, there was a recent TV series made about, and I can't remember what it was called, and I don't know how accurate it all was, but there were many famous artists and so on in this group of us that ended up, my father happened to be a publisher, but they were people who had really big names, and also some prominent political writers or philosophers like Walter Benjamin, who I just told you unfortunately killed himself. But the problem then developed that even though we had a chance to get one of these visas, the Vichy government refused to give any of us exit permits, and you could not really get out of France we also needed a Spanish transit visa, and Spain was not a friendly place to visit at that time, since Franco was now in charge. I mean, it was possible to, apparently, we had heard that you could get across, but the risk was that the Spanish officials had gotten wind of the fact that there were well-known people coming, escaping over the Pyrenees on foot and coming and going across Spain, that they could hold for ransom. So that one of the, even if you had a transit visa, one of the risks that you took. But anyway, so we were not able to get an exit permit, so we had to walk out on foot into Spain.
And that was what year?
That was 1940. In fall of 1940. Still relatively early, still relatively safe. I mean, some people, I think around that time, got out without going into Spain. They were able to go to Marseille and take a boat, get passage to the U.S. from Marseille directly. But I can't remember now what the reason was. We were not able to do that. The American consulate, which in that TV series actually is depicted, they were pretty hostile toward us, and at first refused to hand out our visa, which they held, unless we had an exit permit, which they knew we couldn't get. So this was absolutely, definitely not a friendly, not a friendly situation. There was somebody, and he's also sort of featured in the documentary. There was someone who was trying to mitigate all of these difficulties within the consular service, who was trying to help. And also at that time, Eleanor Roosevelt heard about the fact that the consulate was making difficulties in handing over the visas, and sent Christopher Fry, who actually
big guy,
is a big guy. I mean, he was actually a little guy.
Yeah.
And eventually they got him because they outed him as gay, and so he was actually in the end forced to return. But he not only helped people like us by getting the consulate to hand over these visas, but he helped many Jews escape who were not particularly famous or anything. Where he developed an organization where they falsified the papers, passports, etc., etc., etc. So anyhow, so we actually made our way across the Pyrenees on a very moonless, dark night. So which in some ways, from a safety point of view, was better.
Yeah, as long as you didn't break your ankle.
As long as, and it was, I mean, actually the main problem were cacti. So, I mean, for people like me who had on a two-piece dress that I had made in boarding school in sewing class.
Right.
So, and actually, which also came in handy because anything that you made yourself, you put in very large hems. I don't know why. So it was a two-piece dress that I had made in sewing class, which had a large hem at the end of the jacket and also at the...
So that when you grow, you can let it down.
Yes, probably. That was the original purpose.
Yeah.
However, my father actually managed to get some cash in order to have me carry somebody's diamonds. In the hem of my jacket, in the hem of my skirt, I carried a bunch of diamonds from into Spain for somebody. So it came in handy. My father, who actually wrote a memoir, and one of the things that he describes, which I also remember very clearly, is that so we were given by kind of word of mouth instructions as to how to approach crossing the border. That you could walk so many steps on a highway, etc., and then you would take off across, just going across the fields, and the rock was very, very rocky terrain. Mm-hmm. And because of the fact there was a skirt, since I was delegated as the person who would find out whether, since we couldn't see, we would come to the edge of a rock and we couldn't see whether it was a 10-foot drop or several inches drop. So it was my job to kind of sit down and to see
feel your way. Yeah.
And feel the way, which meant that I had all of these cacti entering in there, and the cacti, the hooks,
I know.
They're like, but it wasn't so much that it was so painful, but they're like fish hooks. So once
you can't get them out.
You can't pull them out.
Yeah.
At least not in any simple way. So one of the big challenges was to not approach the Spanish border station from inside Spain. So fortunately, we somehow managed to come in from the right side, even though it was really pitch dark. We couldn't see anything. And what I also should mention is that my aunt, who had been very kind of courageous and trying to look after me a bit, and so on during our trip, when we were in the middle of crossing the Pyrenees, she decided that she couldn't go any further. And she said, leave me here, I just want to die and I can't go any further, etc., etc. And I, being, somewhere now between 16 and 17 years old, somewhere in my mind popped up the advice that if somebody has a hysterical fit,
you smack them.
You slap them.
Right.
So I decided, okay, this is the time to do this. So I slapped her. She was so taken aback. I sort of pulled her up and went. She came out of it.
Good.
So it was sort of a weird idea that at this very moment, this practical advice.
But it's rather like what Winnicott talked about, that sometimes parents, we don't do this anymore, sometimes parents give a smack because the smack creates the climax that ends the fit.
Yes, it's like a punctuation mark.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So anyhow, so she kind of came out of it, and so I was certainly not going to leave her there, or none of us were going to leave her there. So anyway, so we actually managed to approach the border station, and fortunately the boss was out for the moment, and the whatever lower level official just rushed us into the bathroom to clean up and said, oh, somebody dropped you off by car. That you were not coming across here illegally, and so apparently border station was near the road that we had walked in. And since we did have the Spanish transit visa, so he kind of prepared us. The boss actually never appeared. We were able to get through, since we had the transit visa, the Spanish transit visa, we were able to pass through the Spanish border station.
So there you are in Spain, and then you have to make your way to a port.
We went to Portugal.
Which
so
is not
Cascais, which is a resort, which is a resort right next to Lisbon.
Yes, I have been. I spent a summer there.
Right. So it's both a resort and it's a major port.
Right.
So we made our. It was a little. It was a sort of an underground railroad thing where if you arrived in Madrid, you were going to look for porter number so and so, take you to a safe house overnight and so on, because of the fact that the danger that they would hijack you in some way for money was always kind of clear and present. So, but it was hard to describe because they, this was just post-Civil War Spain, and when you approached Madrid, there was not a bit of green to be seen anywhere. Everything was just shot up full of bullet holes from the Civil War. It was terrible kind of condition, and there were chain gangs working along the railroad tracks, repairing the tracks from being damaged during the Civil War.
So you got to Cascais.
We got to Cascais, and then we had to wait until we could get passage. I mean, of course, the American shipping lines were booked forever, so there was no chance of getting. So we eventually got passage on a Greek boat called the Nea Hellas, and actually on its next trip out, it was torpedoed. But I don't know whether by the Germans or who got this boat, but anyway.
So you were not on the bad boat. So
we were not on the bad boat.
You ended up landing where?
In Hoboken.
Okay. So that's quite a story. Can we move from how you got here to how you got into the field?
Yes. So, to some extent, I was sort of predestined to be in the field because, since we moved, in addition to all these different boarding schools I was in, we also moved quite frequently, and usually for reasons that the grown-ups around us didn't really want to talk about. I mean, they were both not only political problems, they were family problems that caused some of the moves, the frequent moves that we made, and so usually the explanations that were either incomplete, if not designed to obscure what was really going on. But the approach to me was that I was the understanding child, and I would understand. So
you were defined a therapist by the time that you were what would you say?
Yes, not only that,
6?
but there was the other side of it, however, was that I was also aware that I was not getting a full story, even though I was pretty young at the time, and that I was trying to figure out what was actually going on.
So therein lies enough motivation to turn anybody into a therapist.
Completely.
Yeah.
Right. So that was definitely, and of course the other thing that it also meant that I was sort of ready. I mean, I was approached both as the understanding child and with the expectation that I would simply adapt to whatever was going on. So certainly when I came to the U.S., in order to continue my education, I found a way, an au pair position with the person who was the head of the Romance Language Department at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, and who had an invalided wife and wanted him was quite, I thought, ancient actually when I arrived, but probably not quite that old, but was on the elderly side. So they wanted me to help fix food for them and so on. Of course, having been to boarding school, I didn't even know how to make a cup, or barely knew how to make a cup of tea. But I managed to hide that by saying, well, I don't know how you do things here. You have to tell me exactly how to do this.
That was smart.
And that sort of worked. But I very quickly, or perhaps was already pre-programmed, to find a way of adapting to the situation and trying to quickly notice that everybody used knife and fork differently,
Okay.
and try to blend in
Mm-hmm.
and do things the way everybody else did things.
Mm-hmm.
So, which in some way, once I got into the field, was both helpful, but at the same time also made it more difficult for me to go against whatever the
Prevailing orientation was.
prevailing orientation was.
Yeah.
So actually at the point, so I did. So let me backtrack for a moment. So I actually, after being in Iowa, somebody told me about scholarships, and so I began to, and told me how to apply for scholarships, what I had to do, and so I actually applied and got a absolutely complete scholarship at what was then the Florida State College for Women in Tallahassee, Florida,
Interesting.
which is, Tallahassee happens to be the capital of Florida.
I did not know that.
So it's kind of in central, it's very, very much in central Florida. So they offered me, free room and board, all my books free, and some spending money, which was too good an offer for me to turn down.
Right.
So I headed, I went off to Florida,
All by yourself.
completely by myself. Yes, and this was a time in Florida, where which was, I certainly was foreign to me, where on the train platform or the bathrooms, they were colored
Blacks
on
only, right? Yeah.
those kinds of labels,
Yeah.
completely foreign to me. So the university happened to be located in the middle of what were then, I mean, this was just before I ended up I ended up first in Iowa just before the U.S. sometime before the U.S. got into World War II. By the time I was in Florida, we were the U.S. had entered World War II, and there were army bases around us. So I was actually sort of charmed by the fact that he was this very protective. We lived in these high-rise dormitories, and when you came in, there was a desk, and behind the desk was his house mother, and anyone who came to visit you had to have their name looked up to see whether they were on the black list of soldiers who had misbehaved with young Southern women. And they had a golden book of rules, one of which I will never forget because I thought it was so funny, and that said, "You must not recline on the lawn with your date."
You can't make that kind of shit up.
Sitting up sitting up only. So actually, my husband, who had gone to the same boarding school that I had, so he and I sort of at some point when I was back in New York from Iowa, and my father wanted me to go and work and do some housework for a family that he knew. So I was saved from that by the fact that I came down with what had been simmering probably for years, and that is rheumatic fever. And I was actually ill. So while I was ill and convalescing in the backyard after having my tonsils out and so forth, my later to be husband came to visit me, and we became sort of involved. And since he had been the roommate in the boarding school in Holland, which he also attended, where other guys were interested in me, but he was not.
Mm-hmm.
So this was my final conquest there.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case.
So how'd you get from there to becoming a social worker and then an analyst?
So while I was in the school in Holland, I decided in the school in Florida, and in Tallahassee, I had a sociology teacher who seemed to be approachable, and so I said to her, "I want to work with people." She said, "Go to social work school."
It's like the randomness of those things,
yes,
right?
completely random.
Right. So where'd you go to social
Because
work?
they were really not. So actually, when my by then husband was sent overseas, I came back to the city, and actually finished and graduated from NYU. I mean, I had excess number of credits, but they said I couldn't graduate unless I took 2 semesters. So I went to NYU for 2 semesters.
And then you graduated with a BA.
With a BA.
And
then decided to. By that time I had heard about analytic training, and realized that in getting a degree as what was called a psychiatric social worker, there was one institute, namely Postgraduate Center for Mental Health, that would accept me.
It was the only institute that took social workers.
At that time, yes. I mean, NPAP, I think, was founded within a year or two.
Right.
Just somebody, it was not yet. I think within maybe a year or so after. So postgraduate actually, was a kind of interesting place, and that they accepted all 3 disciplines. I mean, you did have to have, I had to have a master's in social work.
Right.
And, so, but they did accept, he was a psychiatrist with so he had an MD. His wife was an MSW. So, and they in fact were both provided analytic training. They were also interested they were kind of activists in community and mental health. As part of our training there, we had to do a community project. So they had a foot in different fields. They ended up having a day hospital. They ran a day hospital for a while.
So at some point,
Postgraduate
Center closed, but that was much later.
Much later.
So what?
I mean, actually, when I first went, they were really very small, in a quite fancy brownstone on the east side, and then moved into a much bigger. Actually, became significantly bigger. Had a large outpatient clinic that was the pool from which the candidates drew their training cases. The people who were in analytic training do their.
So you graduated from there. Did you get on the faculty there, or did you?
I first discovered them because I was looking for a part-time job, which was in that field at that time almost impossible to get. Somebody steered me in the direction. So I didn't realize that the place where I got the job was also a training center, and actually both worked there and was in training at the same time. So my career path, I was kind of pushed along in that I think I was asked to teach before I actually officially graduated.
You were, precocious.
So, but, I think as you know from the other psychoanalytic journey I had to talk about, that at the time that I was in training there, ego psychology was totally dominant. I mean, you didn't even know,
And that was what year?
What year was that?
About.
Early 50s.
Okay.
Late 40s, early 50s.
Uh-huh.
Was really so dominant. Originally, I think there was this one large group that belonged to the New York Psychoanalytic, and then because of the fact that of the objection to their the extreme rigidity with which they maintain criteria as to who can really be an analyst and what is really analytic work, the White Institute split off, which at that time was the Salvanian.
Right. Okay, so how
So
did
that
you
already existed. During my entire time at postgraduate, I never. There was not even a negative mention, not even from a critical point of view, no mention of it. And this was really the time where if you were considered to be dissident, you were out.
Yeah.
And often wrecked economically.
Right.
So
how'd you get from postgraduate to postdoc?
Well, that actually took a number of years in between. So I was first working at a place called the Jewish Board of Guardians, where I had after I graduated, and it's really hard to imagine today. All of these institutions, including hospitals department, were staffed by psychoanalysts.
I know. It's unbelievable given that we are persona non grata in nine-tenths of the world today.
But that dominance at some point began to wane rather quickly. I mean, first of all, especially the Salvanians became more influential. Relational thinking was beginning to, interpersonal,
because relational wasn't until the 80s.
Later, but certainly they were becoming much more influential.
Right.
And so, just take some water. But certainly, much as they had, postgraduate had a kind of messy, eclectic side. So being ostracized by them was not so much the danger. And theoretical differences were not even discussed. There was a point where the Horney group split into two, and a large segment of the Horney faculty, who were mostly men, I think there was one woman, Sarah Schein, was her name, I remember her very well. And so a whole segment of the Horney group came over to postgraduate. Was there any discussion of any theoretical differences between the ego psychologists and no. But because of the fact that it was sort of unique in its way, Bob Stoller was a candidate in training there.
At postgraduate?
At postgraduate. Frank Lackman was a candidate a candidate there, and so was Jim Fasagi. So actually, eventually we all formed. I think Jim did not, but Bob Stoller and Frank and I were part of a kind of study group that we formed, even though. They had been, Jim Fasagi was my supervisee. Frank I didn't really meet until we formed this study group, because somehow we didn't coincide in time. And Bob Stoller was in this first class that I ever taught on psychoanalytic technique. So and I quickly discovered that he had read everything you could possibly read on any subject.
Right.
So we did. There were some other people in this group also from postgraduate, and we began to explore some other points of view. I mean, Bob Stoller already came with the beginning of his theory, and he and Frank together wrote a book on developmental arrest. And
this is like when?
By now we are certainly into the 50s. So Kohut began. So first of all, there was a whole movement afoot that felt that that under the guise of being true scientists, to have a metapsychological model was clinically unhelpful, if not misleading, in terms of some of the ego-psychological formulations, and then Kohut very early in the 50s already wrote a paper saying that, proposing that that a psychoanalytic ego-psychological position should be stripped of its metapsychology, and the field should be defined. He already said in the 50s that the field should be defined by data that can be collected through empathy and vicarious introspection. So he already, and at that point, Bob Stoller had already, began to work with George Atwood, and later to be joined by Donna Orange and Bernie Brancheft. So they were the phenomenologists.
Phenomenological.
The phenomenological branch, who also advocated that, from a psychoanalytic point of view, this should be a pure phenomenology or a pure psychology. So, in fact, they had this kind of commitment in common, and Bob Stoller, in fact, was began to develop some kind of a dialogue with Kohut, but then developed his own model, which was a much more encompassing model. His intersubjective systems model.
Right. Okay, so there you are now, involved with really the luminaries in self-psychology, and you're basically at postgraduate center. How'd you end up at postdoc?
So eventually, some of the people, particularly I think Jim Fasagi became involved. I think he may have been one of the founders of the relational track. I don't know whether Bob had already moved to California, and certainly Frank Luck. So
it was Steve and Manny,
but I think it was Jim actually who began to make a pitch for me to be
considered a postdoc. And this was after or before the relational track came into being?
After the relation.
Okay, so relational track came into being.
I think so.
It was the 80s.
Right.
I can't give a date, but it wasn't early. So you were not involved with postdoc at all until the relational track came into being.
I think so. Yes. Right.
And then it was Jim.
Well, but in the meantime, we had the study group which actually began to include Dora Silverman and other people from somebody else from IPTA. So we were like a mixed orientation kind of a group.
So what was your experience at postdoc like once you were in?
Well, I think in the beginning. Self-psychology was very much part of that. Wherever, I don't really remember at what point. It was certainly post-Kohut, so already there were some changes. And certainly, I think, I don't know whether Luckman and Beebe had already done some of their joint.
They did. Oh, I think so, because Beatrice and I were actually in the same class at NYU, and this was in the early '80s.
Right. Right. So, and actually, in the beginning, I was actually asked to teach a course on self-psychology by Manny Gent. I mean,
Okay,
this was
so
still...
Manny was still...
it still was really a kind of, a bit of a ma and pa operation. Who was it? Who was in charge at that point? Not Man.
Sue Warshaw was the head of the relational track.
Before that, it was a man.
Bernie Kalinkowitz.
Bernie Kalinkowitz,
Yeah.
right.
Who was a really
Bernie
good guy.
actually interviewed me
Uh-huh.
and was very welcoming.
Yes, no, he was a good guy.
Yeah.
He really was.
Yeah. So it was a much more, you could make all kinds of personal recommendations and personal arrangements.
Right. So you taught self-psychology.
I started out teaching self-psychology just about the time when, first of all, self-psychology had been pretty much dissed by the Freudians, of course,
And the interpersonalists.
And then the interpersonalists, and then the relational.
Yes. You've always been the stepchild.
Right. So even though by now, again, I don't quite remember, we were like into the 70s maybe. So after Kohut, after Kohut died in the 80s, self-psychology had already split into various kinds of orientations, including the Storrow, Atwood, and Brandschaft and Orange group.
Right.
And all of them had sort of burst out of the one-person unidirectional influence model that, at least on paper, Kohut maintained. Clinically, he always acknowledged the fact that things were more complicated than that.
So this is too broad a question, and we're running out of time, but if you had to sort of put language to your perception of how postdoc has evolved in the time that you were there.
Well, actually, from my point of view, it was a really interesting place, since I didn't have the same prejudice against other orientations as I was interested in other orientations. I was certainly interested in what infant research in the Boston Change Study Group began to be active, and so there were many changes coming along in the field in general. So in the beginning, we used to have these meetings of the relational track, which included really people who had quite different points of view and different points of view about development.
Yeah, I remember.
Even Stephen Mitchell and Bromberg were not on the same.
Oh no.
So I thought all of this was really very interesting, and I would also have conversations, with Manny Gent, for instance, who said to me, "Well, self-psychology is such a unidirectional, one-person,
blah blah blah,
blah blah blah." and of course, I would always get these comments to anything that I did a little bit of writing there, did some talking there, and they would say to me, "And where's your subjectivity?
And where's the enactment?"
Right. Well, we weren't quite at the enactment yet. But
okay, it was just where's your subjectivity?
Where's your subjectivity? Right. So nonetheless, I thought these meetings were really interesting. I was really interested in how other people thought about things, and thought there are things that you can learn from that. So even though, as self-psychologist was kind of the stepchild of the relational track.
Is there anything that you haven't said that you want to make sure goes on the record with regard to your position, perspective, predictions for the future?
Something
not political.
No.
Can't go there. We'll all take poison and kill ourselves.
Well, right. I can't really think of anything right now. I mean, there are many things that could be said about many things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, certainly I myself feel, that there was a fairly radical change, certainly from the original cohesion position, which continued the emphasis on deficits and deformation, ego deformations and deficits, because of the fact that the basic idea was that without a responsive environment, the infant was born into a world of buzzing and booming as an unstructured, and with the influence of infant research, acknowledged or unacknowledged, very strong influence, the view of the infant has changed very radically.
Right.
And pathology is described in terms of what's present rather than what's absent.
So do you think there's hope for psychoanalysis?
Who knows?
Is that where we should end?
I mean, certainly mental health is in right now.
This is true, but not psychoanalysis.
Well, I think it spills over. I mean, psychoanalysis, if you're talking about psychodynamic therapies,
yes,
that is acceptable.
Yes,
and one could certainly include psychoanalysis among those.
Right. Yep.
Whether it's feasible and practical for most people is another question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just the time.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this. It is a gift to the field to have this story as something that we can pass on to generations. And your clarity of memory is so much better than mine that I'm just like awed.
Although I'm find myself struggling. I mean, in some ways I'm sort of glad to get down before it fades even more.
It sure as hell doesn't sound faded. It sounds very present.
But still, I mean, my memory of sort of, going through all this sort of step by step remains to be pretty clear.
It's remarkable. Well, I can't say that we won't come back to ask you more, but I think you've given us a really lucid and fascinating picture of your life and entry into postdoc.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.